sort of ideas I had. Um, oh, basically, if you have nothing, right? No selector, no target ref, no parent ref. Uh, what we've come up with is that means it's namespace scoped, but it's enforced by ztunnel. So
it's the equivalent of having a promiscuous workload selector.
Okay, got it.
Which was the behavior before, right? If you used before target ref existed, if you had no workload selector, it selected workloads. Mike, in the gateway API, what is the current convention if no target ref is specified?
It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any implicit behavior if nothing's specified. For namespace scope things, we've generally I don't know if we have actual implementations, but the general consensus has been target the namespace. Actually directly target type namespace. And then for global, we've had some ideas batted around about introducing a mesh object to represent global. But we've basically been paused on that because we haven't had great use cases for it. So this could be a use case that would justify something like that. And we know at least the Kuma folks are already interested in introducing this object. So that was Mike Lamont's PR that I have linked there that ended up getting closed. So we potentially have another implementation that has similar needs to do mesh scoped things.
Costin, I think you want to.
Yeah, I have a huge problem with mesh scope things because, well, first of all, in Istio there is no such thing as mesh scope mostly because it's actually an Istio D revision scope for mesh config, and it's far more complicated than it sounds. I mean, we say mesh, but it's not what we think it means. Second, anything mesh scope is probably the most dangerous thing you can do because you can break. I mean, first of all, mesh includes multiple clusters and other things. I mean, it's not mesh for sure, but even a cluster scope is a super dangerous thing because we have multi-tenants, we have multiple revisions. It breaks all the operation stuff that is based on revisions or canary of configs. So I would be very reluctant to have anything that is that dangerous unless there is a super strong reason to have it. Now, per gateway class, that's a different story. I mean, that's limited. Per gateway, it's also perfectly fine. We have 3 different ways to scope things. I mean, to export to sidecar import and some labels that John added to releases, many releases back, and I don't know if it's still around and how many people know about it, where you can scope a configuration to a revision. But I don't think we are in lack of ways to scope things down. What we are in lack of is consistency and in particular in the context of Gamma. If you're using Gamma, how do you scope? I was looking to make some changes to have even services, regular cooperative services, respect some sort of scoping, so they can be marked as visible, not visible in different parts of the system. But I think we should look at kind of the operation and security model that are the basis of the gateway API and the reasons they did some of the things they did, and not go back to global stuff. I mean, globals are and statics are considered harmful, so that applies to configuration as well.
Lynn, I think you're next.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
I guess, okay, sorry about the microphone problem. My recording starting late. So I just had one comment, not specific to what Carsten was saying, but to what Ian was saying earlier about namespace based policy. So I think what I guess kind of surprised me is when I have namespace policy without any workload selector or target ref, right? It's I mean, if I'm doing layer 4 policy, I think it's very, very intuitive. Ztano would treat it as a namespace policy and enforce it. If I'm doing layer 7 policy, that's when it could be potentially be very confusing to the user. Well, in my authorization policy, maybe I have like a method level, for instance, and that's HTTP layer 7. And, I intended to apply to a namespace, but I didn't put any workload selector or target ref. In that case, I assume right now the behavior would be Ztano would actually deny it, right? Because it couldn't interpret it and the waypoint would ignore it. So it's not very straightforward in that scenario. I assume we will use policy status to help guide our user. Is that what people have in mind to help user understand those scenarios better?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer there is certainly to improve the user status, right? I think that's already a scheduled item for 123. We can also use admission control for things that are obviously broken if we want to. And there was some discussion about starting to enable that, but I think we were going to prioritize status.
Okay, but my understanding of how it works was correct. If I have
It is correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think one other. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Keith. Go ahead.
No problem. I was going to make a general point. So Ian, go ahead. I think it'll be helpful for the conversation for you to go first.
Sure. I was just going to say that having no selector, no target ref apply to waypoint in a namespace might be a little bit weird because not necessarily all services are even using that waypoint. And so I do see some value to like binding it to your waypoint directly, like your namespace scoped waypoint, if you've created one, as being the semantics for it. Now, is that a little bit confusing for legacy Istio users coming from Sidecar? Yeah, maybe. And we should call that out and document it. But it is, I think, at least fairly logically consistent, at least.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about the pattern of saying target ref equals namespace for the reasons Ian just mentioned, right? I think it can lead to the potential for confusion. Does it mean all waypoints in that namespace? If the namespace was default or a system namespace, it doesn't mean all gateway classes in that namespace, right? If we were inheriting to gateway class, right? That gets a little funky. And we already have a way to do a per namespace waypoint. So it's not clear that the granularity control of specifying attaching to namespace offers value, and it might add confusion. Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're in one of those classic situations where we have to decide our semantic philosophy. So are we going to design the semantics to represent the concrete implementation, or are we going to try to create a semantic that abstracts the implementation for what we think that the user is going to want to do? So one of the examples here is what Ian mentioned when it comes to if you have a namespace policy, should it affect waypoints? In my mind, the choice I mean, in my mind, the implementation is a namespace policy affects every proxy. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the status quo, but I may have missed something in the last bit of L7 implementation. But my understanding is that namespace policies affect all proxies, whether it's sidecar, whether it's waypoints, whether it's gateways.
Are you asking me in Istio today?
In
That is
Istio
not
today.
true. That is
Okay,
not
so
true.
okay, so namespace policies do not affect waypoints.
Only policies that have target ref defined.
Oh, right, that is correct. Okay, gotcha.
But
Now you
it's
can do target ref service, and you can do target ref gateway and gateway listener. We don't actually currently support target ref namespace for anything.
yeah, I think
Correct, yes.
it's a hurdle user have to think through. I mean, I had the same thoughts. Whereas kids, when I was first exposed to this, oh, I can't do namespace OSCE policy for my waypoint, other than, you know, I use target ref to specify exactly which waypoint.
Yeah, so essentially we have a bifurcation of a complete bifurcation of policy attachment. We've got
Yes.
the old Istio way, which has namespace and workload selector. That's kind of one family of policy, and then you've got the gateway family of policy that is only target ref. So gateway API gateways and waypoints only have policy attached to them via target ref. If we don't have that in docs, we should really have that in docs. Because I misunderstood. It very well may be there, but I'm just old. Haven't checked it in a little while, so I apologize.
Yeah, that is true. There is one unfortunate exception to that, but we don't have to go into it.
Craig and I are working on some doc updates that will hopefully make some of it more clear. But I don't think much is published as of this moment.
Okay, so now that we're all collectively clear, at least in this meeting, that's the behavior and the intended behavior. It was certainly the documented behavior in the design docs. Admin policies. Is gateway class a good solution to that problem? The one issue I can see with gateway class is the ability to partition classes. Right now, we just have one class. So I can't have different groupings of admin policy and say revision or control them, right? Like you'd need, like if I wanted to vary admin policy by revision, I can't really do that today. I don't remember what we said about support for a revision selector on the policy type attachments.
Do we want to set policy per revision? As whatever's the default revision should, if it's not, well, we do have that support, but we probably want whatever's the default revision to be applying it.
So would it be possible to stick with target refs that are defined in upstream and not add more complexity and confusion? Because I don't think anyone else will have namespace or other target refs. I mean, it should be. We already have the
we're just literally discussing whether target ref equals gateway class is the right way to achieve a mesh-wide admin-like policy.
No. I understand that. I mean, it's I mean, whatever that means, because it's what is the admin of what? Admin of the gateway, admin of the cluster, admin of the mesh, admin of the. But I would be very reluctant to attach to anything except the 5 things that are defined in the spec, unless there is a very, very strong reason to do so.
Right, gateway class being one of the things defined in the spec.
Gateway class is definitely in the spec, so that's fine. But namespace and other things are not.
So, Louis, the answer to your question from an upstream gateway perspective is technically no, because we've weighted away from the boundaries of direct policy attachment, and now we're in inherited policy attachment. And technically, according to the spec, you would set the default in the policy itself, and the controller would take care of kind of passing it down for all those things. I agree it is somewhat obsolete. I think Nick is trying to fix it, but as far as on record, that's what it is today. And I bring that up mainly because if we're going to create something else like target ref gateway class, or target ref mesh, whatever we come up with is probably going to be new, and we should chat with upstream gateway API before we create a new standard.
Well, let's see. I don't think there's. So, explain to me again what you think is the currently limiting thing of an inherited policy, right? So there was the gateway class is the template thing, right, which we all think is silly, right? I think we've been over that. So what is the actual technical limitation in the gateway specification? Just saying, like, it doesn't make any sense, I think, to attach. I mean, in theory, you could attach an HTTP route, I guess, to a gateway class. I'm not sure it should support it, and status would be the right way to reject it. But what is the actual specification part of gateway that prohibits this?
The thing that's weird with gateway is not the inherited thing is not the attachment. It's that they want you to have a literal field defaults and overrides and like this weird semantic around that. So that's the part that's going away. And so I don't think there's any other issues, or I'll let Keith tell me what the other issues are.
I would agree with John that the existing spec with like the nested defaults and overrides is basically obsolete. I linked in Backscroll in chat somewhere. There's a discussion 2927 where we're talking about the proposed changes to the policy attachment spec and basically eliminating the kind of split between inherited and direct policy. So it's just one policy that can reference a thing, and then we'll have like expected behavior for like how things should implicitly set defaults at if they're targeting like a higher level thing. And to Constance's point, like namespace is in that hierarchy currently. I can go dig up the docs in Gateway. I would be cautious about targeting namespace because if our implementation does not apply to all traffic, and like in that case, maybe targeting a gateway directly or targeting the gateway class if it's like the waypoint specific gateway class rather than one for all of Istio. If that reflects what our implementation is doing, I could see that making sense.
So I haven't seen the namespace in that spec. Maybe I missed it, but what does it even mean? I mean, you have a gateway. Why would you attach to a namespace? Is it only for gamma or anyway? I think we mostly agreed to not use namespace, so it's probably not
well, no, I think
reason
Mike is pointing out that in the gateway discussions, they are thinking about using namespace.
Yeah, I'll grab the link. I'll grab the link to the hierarchy doc that includes it. But I think that it's attaching to specifically the waypoint gateway makes more sense if the policy is only affecting traffic which passes through that gateway. If the policy is actually able to be enforced universally for all traffic entering the namespace, then attaching to the namespace makes sense. If we're not trying to do that, then there's a mismatch of like user expected behavior and like reasonable expectations versus like what the UX of the policy would be.
But how can you can opt out of ambient, you can opt out of sidecar, you can do all kind of other things, and otherwise it's network policy and regular stuff that doesn't have any attachment. I mean, it's not. We are getting to a state where we are trying to fit everything into the gateway, and the gateway is starting to get into kind of even worse than Istio in terms of so many. I mean, in Istio we have so many features that are kind of halfway baked, and in gateways everything is optional, and it's almost impossible to know what an implementation will do. So I think we should be, gateway is great, and I've been preaching gateway for a long time, but we should not go to the extreme, and especially since Gateway has now so much
Yeah.
optional stuff and undefined stuff. We have our own APIs and they work relatively well. I mean, even workload selector, it is not so bad in some cases. We can keep supporting it maybe.
Yeah, so I guess, Mike, just what you described, and it's the optionality that I think is the concern, right? Either you're attaching policy to the thing that will implement it, or you're attaching policy to a context where it may or may not be implemented.
That's scary.
Right,
yeah.
Right, that part is scary. Like if I attach an HTTP route to a namespace and there's no gateways, nothing happening, the policy is, right, it's useless.
With no status to say that it's not in effect.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so
if
we're
you
all
try
falling back to
attach-
status anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, you would get like accepted false because it's invalid. Yeah.
Is any user, have you seen any user actually looking at the status and understanding what's there? Because I think we are also kind of over statusing.
In assisting some of the users with their ambient onboarding and explaining to them where they would have found the information, explaining why things weren't working in status, I think they are trainable, Gustin, to do that. We just haven't done it yet.
Yeah, logs, HTOD logs are the best source. And yeah.
I think especially for like the really coarse grade, like because when you end up saying like half dozen status conditions, yeah, you can lose stuff in there. If you train them to look for like accepted true or like conflict or something very basic like that, that's going to be almost universal, that should be like a thing we can train people to do.
Yeah, no. Basic stuff is wonderful, but as usual, we take a good idea and we make it so complicated that it's, I mean, there is a gap to put DNS provisioning, whatever. I mean, it's now status is becoming a database for all configurations. We don't need Kubernetes, we can put everything in status. I don't know. It's
I mean, maybe I should put it in the list below, but probably Istio explain to me why this isn't working, right? Is probably actually what users want the UX to be. But I don't want to get into details about the UX, or we can get into that in a little bit. But we do have we still have to make a decision about what to do with Ian's question. Mike, you seem like the only person who had an initial objection to targeting gateway class, at least judging by the chat thread. Are your objections somewhat alleviated, or do they still remain?
I think they're somewhat alleviated by the fact that like the scope of what the implementation is doing is actually closer to the Waypoint's gateway class. Yeah, I think if we were trying to do something that was like actually global, then it wouldn't necessarily be the right fit. But I think the implementation matches what we're considering targeting here.
Okay. At some point, we'll probably have more than one Waypoint class. Even Istio itself might have more than one Waypoint class.
And that's part of my concern. Yeah, I think that's a potential future expectation.
Yeah, and so I think it's okay as long as that cardinality is low to say policy type target refs equals the set of classes, or partition across them as you see fit. Yeah, I guess we'll just have to look at crossing that bridge when we come to it. Coming back to the revision thing a little bit. Because I don't think we've really, right now we use the revision label to decide which control plane should be the control plane for a given waypoint implementation. That means that we don't have the ability to vary policy implementation by revision, which you could debate whether that's useful or not. I'm just pointing out that that's the limitation. At some point, we could support that. I thought there was some ability to put a policy, a revision label on a policy type, but maybe it's just for the data plane implementation things and not actually for the policies. I don't know if anybody remembers.
What do you mean? So you can put a revision label on an off-Z policy, for example, and only STODs with that revision will program their proxies with that authorization policy. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's the thing I'm referring to.
Gotcha.
So I could have two authorization policies point at the same gateway class, have disjoint revision labels on them.
Yep.
And then I can have a gateway with a revision label matching one of those two, and it would pick up that policy, but not the other.
Correct. Yes.
I mean,
Obviously, that isn't implemented today, but
so we don't even support that for RC policy for sidecar, right? You can't specify revision RC policy or any issue classical resources today.
I believe you can. Yeah, you can. There is something we did with RC policy a while ago. It was target ref. We added target ref, and we have the semantics. We actually added an upgrade note to tell you to change their revision of their old RC policies for like a one-time upgrade type. I can't remember what it was specifically for security reasons, but that is implemented today.
Okay, so that's only for target ref, not for
WordPress? No, it's at the core of Istio, so it applies to literally everything. It's a little bonus we slipped in and didn't document on purpose for a long time. So that way you can have the same object with different config applied to two different revisions was the intent.
Yeah. So basically STODs will filter the resources that they read based on the revision label.
Yep.
They just won't see the other ones.
Okay, and the reason
now that I'm thinking about it, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, now that I think about it, I don't think the ambient controller respects that. But that's pretty easy to add. There's a lot of things the ambient controller doesn't respect because it's all built on the new KRT stuff. So I think the multi-cluster is probably not working properly. Anyhow, continue.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. The reason I'm asking is if it's not documented, most of users probably don't know how to use it. Do we envision people would use it on special cases? Maybe there's some certain CVE or security issues, then they would put revision on their Istio resources.
So let's say we added a new field to authorization policy. And using that field could only work with one revision. The schema was forward and backward compatible, right? So we updated the CRD. But the semantic, or what it did, right, would have a meaningful effect. And so we wanted to bind its implementation to a specific revision during an upgrade process.
Okay, yeah, understood.
So it's a pretty pointy tool, but it does have uses in those types of complex upgrade scenarios where there's maybe some semantic change going on.
Right, not for simple addition, only if there are semantic changes, right? That's when you would consider it.
Generally speaking, yes. I think we've also, if we've had problems with schema maintenance for whatever reason, although that's obviously really tricky with CRDs. But yes, it's mostly the semantic part.
Okay.
Yeah, we've done this. I think in the release where we added target ref, we added an upgrade note for this because John thought about it once we released it, and there is something about the not having a target ref or having both, and we told users to That's what it was. It was some impact with how like old revisions would interpret a target ref and apply or not apply it. And so we had users to, if they use target ref, to label their auth policies with a revision label. So even though we might not always intend to, or rather, you might not intend to make schema changes. Sometimes if we're adding things like target ref that change the way that policy is attached, that might be unavoidable.
Yeah, it's also useful for experiments, just being honest, right? Like you create a new revision, it reads all the default policies, but you want to test something, right? You're going to use that revision in a specific namespace or for a specific workload. Maybe the policy is an admin-like policy. So you don't want it to have a universal blast radius. You can control it that way. Okay, so I think that mechanism solves my, hey, do we need multiple waypoint classes to do revision-like testing of admin-like or fleet-wide policies, because we can use the revision labels to control them. So that's a safety net. So I'm happy enough with that. And I thought that it existed. Okay, so should we proceed on the understanding that attaching policy to gateway class is probably the right thing to do?
It's certainly the least bad option. I'm just going to echo what was mentioned before about seeing if we could possibly get the gateway community behind it before or alongside our implementation.
Why do we need the community to do anything? Because, it's target ref can be set to anything. We don't actually need buy-in from other vendors.
Well, the only type we're actually care about right now is the authorization policy. I don't think that was the only one that had an admin fleet-wide effect before. I think it's the only one, maybe request authentication. You could make an argument for allowing it to be class attached. It's really hard to make an argument for route to be gateway class attached.
Well, route, yes, but
no, that's not allowed in the spec currently, as far as I know.
Right.
Yeah,
just logically, you're like
yeah,
like I guess route / some reserved name to black hole. I guess in theory you could make an argument for it, but go do the work.
But any policies that we want could be attached. I mean, we can put the target ref to mesh config and attach it to a gateway if we choose to. I mean, it's someone implemented. I mean, it's a reasonable way to scope configuration, and I don't see any reason not to do it, whatever the upstream gateway community thinks.
yeah. I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's any like upstream blocker of like needing to like socialize anything there. I think it would be helpful in the discussions about how we're trying to fix policy attachment upstream to be like, hey, here's our proposal. We have an example of how we expect this to work, and basically give that as feedback into that conversation. Really, the only tricky part is how the like precedence of, if you have this gateway class targeted authorization policy, what happens if you target a policy at a narrower scope than that? So if you target an authorization policy at a specific waypoint gateway, or at a namespace, or at a service, or something like that, just what is the interplay between those?
Yeah,
so that's. Go ahead, Dawson.
No, keep going.
Well, so to Mike, your question, like that's the reason why the inherited policy attachment had both defaults and overrides, so that you could kind of define both directions for how things are going to work.
And everybody hated it.
Everybody hated having both. So I think we should the best thing is probably just to be opinionated here, and to push for a single direction. I tend to like Istio's direction, where the more specific it is, it becomes an override. If
So yeah, I think it's defaults or like global defaults by default. Basically, a more specific thing will take precedence as a default, and if we want to do something of like globally enforced overrides, we can design that later, but I don't think that's necessary to start with.
Trying to
Agree.
find generic solutions for such complicated problems that fit every use case, it's problematic. I mean, if there is a use case for admin to set up policies that is mandatory and cannot be overwritten, should be explicit about a target policies that is mandatory policy or whatever. If we want to set defaults, we can set a policy creating defaults. I mean, that's easy for a user to understand. Hey, this is a default policy, instead of trying to say, oh, if we combine this and that in a particular order. That's what people hated about the original policy attachment. You can have two APIs, one API default, whatever one. I think it's clean and simple, and we can implement it gradually as needed for each feature that needs one.
Just while I'm talking about types, I presume the telemetry type would make sense to be gateway attached. I mean, gateway class attached.
Is that only for layer 7, I assume?
Well, gateway does both layer 4 and layer 7, so it's just right. It's really like which gateways are going to do it. Today, I think if you put the telemetry API in Istio system with no selector, it's considered to be global default, right?
Right. Yes.
So that's the same as authorization policy in that respect. I'm not even going to mention the terrible words envoy filter.
So I have a
Are there-
question. So sorry, I thought you were done. Are you done on this?
I was just going to ask if there are other APIs that make sense to be gateway class attached.
Okay.
Request auth in maybe.
That one seems really risky. And there is no global default for that today.
True. I'm thinking through the use cases. I'm imagining maybe like you want to set some trusted JWT issuer, but that would still be through auth policy, I guess. So yeah, you create it and issue. Okay, yeah, never mind. I agree.
Yeah,
I mean, it could, but
yeah, maybe WASM plugin resource, I can imagine that being global, right? If I want to apply maybe something to strip out logs.
do we have a global default for WASM plugin?
Oh, it's workload selector based, right? So if you don't specify selector,
But
wouldn't
do we
that
process it same namespace only, or if it's in Istio system, do we process it?
I originally thought that the only thing we did the Istio system thing for was auth policy. But
I thought
telemetry.
I thought it was all in telemetry, but
I think destination rule, I think we introduced global destination rule too.
yeah, but that's handled totally differently now in Ambient.
Yeah, like that's
Yes,
a host
it
name
is.
based metric. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that one counts.
I would have to check
Ian,
on WASM.
Yeah,
Ian, do you think you could check those things? But yeah, if the WASM one is global, then yeah, the same rule would apply.
Yeah, so what else is the workload selector based? I think these are the only one, telemetry, WASM, and OSCE.
Envoy filter.
Envoy filter, yes, of course.
Global envoy filters just no. Never.
I'm just gonna put it here.
Okay, I'm going to ask my question on the gateway class. So for the gateway class, if I'm using, let's say if I'm writing an OSCE policy reference to my gateway class and I wanted to make it a global policy, do I also have to deploy this policy in the Istio system or Istio root namespace? Is that in conjunction or it's all relationship?
I think that's reasonable to expect that they're in the same namespace.
Okay, that makes sense because my question is how do you restrict the user not abuse a reference to gateway class, right? So you restrict it by whoever owns the namespace on the admin namespace to say that's the person who can apply global policy.
100%. Yeah, you've got to have some ability to have RBAC on whatever's going to be an admin policy.
I think somewhere in the policy spec, I forget where or if it's current to what extent, but we're trying to have policies co-located in the namespace of the resource they're targeting, because having policies reach across namespaces gets incredibly confusing very quickly, even for a thing that's already confusing and complicated.
The problem is that gateway class has no namespace.
Yeah. Would we ever
So-
consider like reference grant? Probably no. It seems like just hardbound root namespace.
That's not a terrible idea. Like if reference grant is a highly privileged namespace, or somebody would have to reference grant the gateway class. Gateway class is a CRD is kind of installed and managed by the cluster admin. Not a horrible idea, but it feels like there's a lot of moving parts. It feels like there's more moving parts there than specifying the system namespace.
Yeah.
I think it's up to the controller. Right, classes are owned by controllers. I think we just like that just might be overdoing it. I mean, we could do it.
Yeah,
but I don't think we
I
need to
agree
do
it's
it.
overdoing it. Yeah, I think system namespace is totally reasonable.
Certainly seems reasonable that we could wait until someone comes up with a really good use case that we haven't thought of, but yeah.
Okay, I added a note to just say right now only process gateway class attach policies from Istio system, but really it means where the Istio controller is logically residing.
There's a flag for it. There's a system namespace flag, and you should key it based on that.
Okay, I think we're good here. Next topic in the remaining minutes. Oh, Costin, sorry.
Maybe that's a hand earlier, Carsten.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's the end.
I was trying to capture hot topics that we have seen from people going through the adoption process for Ambient. There have been a few people now getting walked through doing this in Slack and actually making pretty good progress. We had Sarko, right, which we did some PR about. There, I think, is now Daniel, I think is his name, who's
Daniel.
been doing this and has also succeeded. But they obviously ran into things, and we're starting to see an accumulation of feedback. So I captured some of them. Daniel ran into the ingress to waypoint composition question.
Sako too.
Okay, yeah. For those not completely familiar with the topic, in Istio today, ingress traffic does not, by default, or conveniently even, go through a waypoint before it goes to a workload in the waypoint's namespace, even if the workload has a waypoint. This creates a couple of interesting effects and is also a kind of perceptual question that users have. Daniel, in this case, assumed that it would. And when it didn't, he was a little bit surprised. He was able to deal with it. And we could say whether that was a documentation thing or not. But the other thing that it does is it creates a bit more pressure on APIs. So Daniel was trying to use request authentication, and he attached a request authentication policy to the ingress. But he had some workloads in his mesh that did not need request authentication done. There was a namespace. The request authentication API doesn't let you exclude certain hosts or certain traffic from being processed. There's an API and Envoy to do this today, but request authentication doesn't expose it. And so in the sidecar world, he could have solved this problem by putting request authentication into sidecars and having ingress not do it. Or in a waypoint world, he could have put it on the waypoints and had ingress not do it. But because ingress bypasses the waypoints, he couldn't easily achieve the right grain of selectivity to achieve this effect. And he had to do some workaround, which was a little clunky. And so there's this interesting, because we don't let ingress talk to waypoint, it puts a little more pressure on the APIs to have greater selectivity control over traffic. Otherwise, they can't be implemented. If they could be implemented by the waypoints, then they're controlled or bound to the scope of the traffic that the waypoint is designed to handle. And then therefore they are quite selective because they're effectively policies would happen after a first layer of routing. And so it's an interesting kind of tension point that we saw. And we have to make some decisions about this. One of which is the default choice of, hey, ingress, don't go through waypoints, a good choice? Would expect. Should we change it? Or what else should we do about it? Keith, go ahead.
One clarifying question and then some comments. What was the basis for the decision to have ingress not go through waypoint? Was it perf, complexity? Like, what was the basis behind that decision?
Was it related to routes, so you don't have the routes calculated twice?
No.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah,
Sorry.
partially.
Or at least you asked the etymology of the decision, right?
Okay. Yeah.
You can obviously compose routing with waypoints, right? Like I can have very high level routing done on the ingress, right? And then very fine grained routing done on the waypoint. That works just fine. If you try to attach the same route policy to both, right? And did target ref equals waypoint and target ref equals ingress, probably wouldn't have much of an effect, honestly.
So my understanding is when the traffic is the target is being determined by the ingress gateway, right? It would be the endpoint instead of the service. So then if we send the endpoint to the actual destination, so then if user would expecting treating it as a service, then it would be very confusing, right? So because your waypoint maybe not handle workload in that case.
So it's a little, there's a little complexity in how the control plane should interpret it, right? But if you have a route and the route says the destination for the traffic for this route is a service, and that service has a waypoint, then you would go to the waypoint, right? The ingress would not go to the endpoint, right? That's how you would have to interpret it. Now, we didn't implement that yet, right? So not implementing that complexity was a side effect of choosing to bypass the waypoint, but that's what you would have to do.
The hard part with having ingress bypass waypoints though is that we've taken away a policy enforcement point. So with sidecars,
Yes.
every single endpoint had something to enforce policy. If we're going to bypass waypoints, the only policy enforcement point that you have is the ingress gateway, which to your point earlier, Louis, puts pressure not only on the APIs, but also just generally from a conceptual model, all of the responsibility of the ingress gateway.
So there were two possible models, effectively, or kind of API models. There's the default, and then how do I specify not the default? We could have said the default is if the route specifies a service backend and the service itself has a waypoint, then you would go to the waypoint. And that could have been the default. And then there would be, okay, well, how do I fast path this so I don't, right? There's some traffic, I don't want it to go to the waypoint. Taking that extra hop is too much in terms of latency. And so I want to bypass the waypoint. And where would that exist? Right? Would it be something on the waypoint, on the waypoint's gateway? Would it be on the service or something like that? Or some part of that hierarchy where you could say, if traffic from X, skip me, right? That type of API. And maybe the decision was premature optimization, right, to bypass. Now that does bring up the somewhat painful question of, this is beta, could we switch the default? If we thought it was the right thing to do. Because we better do that quickly, right?
Yeah, proxyless gRPC is a very good example of this because if you know that the server supports policies and enforces policy through I mean, either sidecar also it's kind of a good use case, but for this I mean there are all kind of discussion about what is a clean way to do it, and I think having some list of ports that can be used by applications that know what they are doing is both clean, simple, and easy to understand for the user, and doesn't require a lot of complexity on our side. So we already have the H-bound port, which is special. We can allocate a port or a few ports that can be even fixed, and says that if you know what you are doing and you can enforce policies on programmatically, then use this dedicated port, and CNI and other things can get out of the way. Versus all kind of other policies that require changes, annotations, API changes, and all the other stuff. And it's consistent with the current practice, actually.
Yeah, I mean, we already have that type of control, right? Out of mesh traffic going to Z-tunnel, not hairpinning, right, is controlled by Alt-Z policy, right? So we have the security parts actually in place to permit it. It's more the machinery of actually telling egress to do the bypass, right, which is a feature of Istio, not a feature of the layer 4 features of Z-tunnel, I suppose. Ben, I think you were next.
This is maybe a dumb question, but if you have an ingress that targets the service that is waypoint back, but you want some things to not go through the waypoint, why not just define a new service that doesn't have a waypoint and put those things behind that?
That works.
Like, what's difficult what is hard about that for people? Because that's real, like, it's, yeah.
I don't know if the waypoint bypass is the hard part. The hard part in my mind is the fact that most gateways, including its ingress gateway, route to endpoints rather than services.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah.
And also CNI, since you are asking, the CNI can be very messy. That's why I mentioned having dedicated ports, because then CNI can have the dedicated ports, and because it's not going to change every time you put a label or something. At least with a dedicated port, egress can bypass, because we know that the destination port is dedicated for direct, and the receiving side can bypass. Otherwise, CNI becomes a mess.
So Keith, on your point, right? Like there's a genuine issue, right? Obviously, Istio waypoints, sorry, Istio ingresses could know, oh, this service has a waypoint. I'm going to send it to the waypoint. For a non-Istio ingress, right? The solutions that we have for that are, it's either sandwiched, right? So it can do that by talking to the service VIP, which would get captured by ztunnel. For a non-sandwiched one, the simplest solution would be to talk to the waypoint service for that traffic. You would have to know to do it. And maybe we'd have to provide some machinery to make that possible. Those cases. John, I'm sure you have opinions.
Wouldn't you want the sandwich to behave the same as non-sandwich, though, which implies that the Istio ingress needs to go to workload waypoints at least, ignoring services?
That's what the implementation would like to do, but it's not what the users seem to think is going to happen with policy.
Well, I
Right, that's
haven't seen a
the
user
tension here.
use workload waypoints yet, so maybe it's a bit
Right.
for you.
No, right. So, but we have seen people want to attach policy in front of services
Yes.
via waypoint.
Yeah. So I think that's like I'm trying to separate those.
Like it's hard, right? Because we have composition in terms of policy and then composition in terms of network hops, and we're trying to align them.
Yeah. I mean, in my mind, it's just we added something in destination rule that says service addressed or not or something, and then that's it.
And for service addressed, what is doing the redirection to the waypoint?
So how it would work in my mind is that I'm going to go in internals because I think it's easier to explain. We have a cluster for the service. Today, that would have a bunch of endpoints. What we would do instead is that there would just be endpoints that are the waypoint. And so we would not do any load balancing. We would go through all the routing policies, pick a cluster, and it says, okay, we finally figured out we're going to the HTTP bin service. Now we're going to the HTTP bin waypoints, and then all the service policies and whatnot apply at the waypoint. That makes sense?
I think that works, but part of the concern was the third-party waypoint as well, though.
But third-party waypoint, they need to go do the stuff that Flynn has been pushing for upstream to make that a standard in Gateway API, I think. I don't see much alternative there.
Oh, I need to get familiar with that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, I think this sounds good, and yeah, I want to eventually get something into Gateway API to either like, if it's configurable in some meshes, then like allow you to specify it, and we can run ahead and do whatever there first, and then in status at least like report what model is being used if it's not like an optional configurable thing, if like your implementation only supports one way.
Well, another way to do this, which may be cleaner and more interoperable, is to just use headers and not, so basically have the protocol include all the information instead of relying on the IP address. So the gateway could include not SOCKS but something similar when communicating with the L4 and so forth. So without relying on IP.
Like if we consider a non-mesh aware ingress routing traffic, and it doesn't do anything special, so you want to tell it to go to the waypoint, right? You just literally point it at the waypoint service. Right now, obviously we have to debate, like, let's say hypothetically the waypoint service, the waypoint implementation accepts, right, plain text non-HBone traffic, right? It will see host headers and everything else, right, and can route based on it. That's okay. So there's at least a way to compose with legacy ingresses, for want of a better term, right? That users can actually get it working. if you want, like, I think that's there's obviously a large universe of existing ingresses today that are not mesh aware, right? So we're gonna, like, they'll either be sandwiched or not. And we'll have to tell people how to program them to work. For waypoints, I think it's a little different, right? Waypoints is a conformance specification, right? And they have to do or not do certain things, right? For vendors to plug them in. There'll be some options, but we can have a greater set of requirements on them.
Waypoints are enforcement points and places where you attach policies, but doesn't say anywhere in the APIs that they must be physically present and be be two hops or anything like that. You just say, hey, this is a policy. I expect anything that goes to this service to apply this policy. Please enforce it. If the gateway happens to enforce it, wonderful. If the waypoint enforces, wonderful. If the application itself is enforcing it, that's fine too. So I don't think we are required to do. It's more flexible than just saying that it must go through waypoint.
Oh, sure. I just meant composition in terms of like protocols and binding mechanisms custom.
Yeah, if necessary. I mean, yeah, we should not get into the mind that it has to go to waypoint. It's
okay. So what do we like? We have to make a call about changing the default. As Ben pointed out, there is a workaround, which is create a service, have it be excluded from a waypoint, which already exists as an API, and then point ingress at it. And that should work.
No, the waypoint won't match the traffic. It's going to get a request to the waypoint itself. It's going to look at it and say, I don't know what the hell this is, and drop it.
A service for your app that doesn't have a waypoint, though, we would just totally bypass it. That would be our API for bypass.
That's just Kubernetes at that point, but you'd have to handle termination yourself with the app, right? Which is what people do already, basically.
Wait. I thought this was to get traffic to the waypoint, right?
Yes. So yes, I think there are changes needed in waypoint.
Yeah. So that will make that will get the traffic there, but then it will get dropped when it's there.
Yes.
So.
Today the current implementation almost certainly breaks. Like we have to make code changes to fix this.
But logically, that makes sense, like as a way to configure things as a user, even if the implementation doesn't do that yet. Yeah, like that seems obvious in a good way.
But do we have consensus? Like, this is a big decision. I don't want to pretend that it's not.
Yeah, I'm
happy to work up a design document about this if people feel like they need a bit more context. And
yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you're saying when you say, do we have consensus? So what I think is that we should default on send to workload waypoints and opt in to send to service waypoints. Ideally, the opt-ins be a destination role, but we can debate that.
Yeah, I'm thinking even opt out for service traffic. I'm thinking to opt out of the waypoint, but because if you want to think about not just ingress but also sidecar as well, right? If my source is a sidecar, I would expect that waypoint to enforce my auth policy.
Sidecars is way more complicated because in ingress, this is the last mile decision at the cluster level in Envoy. In sidecars, we'd have to do it at the beginning of routing. Like we'd have to match and listener and short circuit everything. Because in ingress, service is just the back end, but in sidecar, service is the front end and the back end. So that's where the difference is.
We should include sidecar in a design doc. Like there's a lot of scope here.
Yeah,
Yeah, I guess my point is user might be sync them consistently as to, the client is in the mesh. What is the behavior of the waypoint?
Yeah, aligning user expectations with what the implementation is actually doing is important.
I mean, I think ideally with Sidecar, it would probably follow the Z-tunnel logic, right? If it was originally addressed to the service and the service has a waypoint, probably should go to the waypoint. I mean, it doesn't, and that's probably not trivial, but that would be, I think, fairly consistent.
Yeah, the reason why that's why I view that as really separate from Ingress is that the way that that's implemented is totally different because
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and it's like we
Yeah,
don't even match based on IP, so it's like what does it even mean for traffic to be destined to a service in a sidecar where we're like kind of have this really fuzzy matching logic? It's pretty blurry. I don't even know how we would implement it if we don't do the cluster IP matching changes that we talked about.
Yeah.
I see.
Which maybe we do that.
Right. But yeah, I don't mean to imply that this change is easy in any way. If we're going to make these changes, like it might be quite a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, the Ingress one's easy. I accidentally implemented it when I didn't understand what I was implementing it, and decided we didn't want it. So we can just revive that. But sidecars, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Right. We also had this other question, right? Does Ingress support Gamma? Right. Which is kind of, or does just Waypoint support Gamma? Right. Policies attached to services and other things, whereas in Ingress, policies only attached to gateways and listeners and routes. Right. It did get a little. In Ingress, it was a bit funny, right? Or it's felt a bit funny to use Gamma. And I don't think we interpret that today.
I don't think there's
Right, in Ingress.
anything. I don't think there's anything specifically in the Gateway API spec that would prohibit you from targeting a service with policy for a north-south only implementation. I don't know of anybody who does currently, but I think it's possible.
Right, so you have these. Would it make sense in an Ingress to have a route which specified a service as the backend? The service itself had a route attached. Would people expect that to compose, or do you want to cut?
I think it does. Let me go look up the quadrant proposal because I think that they're the ones that have done the most work with policies and might do something like that for like retry policy or something like that.
I could see for things like retry that would be okay. Routing, maybe less so.
Yeah. There's definitely some that would be tricky and would not make logical sense to have those kind of targets. Then there's others that are a lot simpler.
Like certainly if we're doing composition, like load balancing policy, right, is a varying utility. Ian, I think your hand was up.
I think Costin beat me. Go ahead, Costin.
Oh, sorry, on accident.
Oh, Ian, then you're.
All right. Yeah, I was just going to ask John, in your suggestion about opting in with destination rule, do we want to allow someone to say, I want to send like 1% of traffic to Waypoint to try it out and see what happens to my latency or whatever?
If we're going to do sidecars, then it can't be in destination rule. If
Yeah.
it's ingress,
Sorry,
it can't be.
for ingress.
For ingress, sure. I don't see why not. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a little weird, I suppose, but sure. I mean, it's easy. It would be harder to not do it that way. To put it
Okay.
another way. Yeah. And yeah, I think that is actually kind of a neat use case that maybe someone would want to do. So.
Yeah, for testing. Okay, I have a question. So remember our get started guide for Ambient, right? So in that get started guide, from ingress gateway to product page, if we were to implement traffic to workload, always go through waypoint if it's coming from ingress, like John, you were saying in the chat, would you also expect user would have to config the waypoint for workload as well?
Yeah, and if they don't, then they wouldn't go through it, right?
Okay, so I'm asking is based on the way the get started guide is written, if we were to make that change, then the RC policy still wouldn't be applied from ingress.
Yeah, it has no impact.
Unless the user change to like allow workload.
Yeah.
Okay. That was my question. I'm not very intuitive to the user, but yeah.
Yeah.
I'm confused. You are saying that we should make the change that requires it, or if users want to? I mean, I'm a bit confused by this discussion. Some parts seem to imply that we want this to be a default or something the user do instead of something that user may do if they want an extra hop.
Costin, what the confusion is that there's a way to say that a workload is for a waypoint, and that's not the way that most people will use waypoints, and it's not the default operation for waypoints. What we're saying is that if you do opt into that, then we should actually respect it properly. So it's not a double opt-in, basically.
No, but that's the opt-in is to have mesh traffic go to be enforced by the waypoint. But if the gateway is already enforcing the policies, or
right,
may
it's
have
not
different
though.
policies, why would you
you're
go
basically
through?
saying that you're turning this waypoint into an inbound sidecar, right? So a gateway does not bypass inbound sidecar today, right?
But that because it cannot, not because we don't want. I mean, it's again, if the policies have been applied, why would we have? Because then you have problems of behavior, semantics. I mean, maybe the traffic from gateway has different policies than the traffic that goes through a waypoint because it's the internet. My point is not necessarily the sidecar behavior was correct. I mean, I don't think it was intentional. It was just by accident, and we didn't consider too much the interaction with gateways. And it may be better what we have now.
Okay, so I think it's pretty clear. We need a design document.
Yes.
We need it fairly quickly. So I guess I'm volunteering to go work on that. We'll have a decision to make about whether to change the default behavior, which we're going to do that will be fast, right? So hopefully people are amenable to ingesting this design document as quickly as I can produce it. And I welcome all the impending feedback. And we'll probably move this discussion to ambient dev. On the other points that came up in user discussions, right? A lack of ability to control the allocated resources for waypoints. This was actually showed up in some performance testing that we did here at Solo. Right, like you pay for your latency with CPU, so people should be able to control that knob probably.
Yeah, there's like 3 or 4 different issues and discussions that I tried to start cross-referencing that are all asking for, yeah, I saw Lynn on there too. They're all asking for like very similar underlying functionality.
Yeah. And then the other one that we saw a few times was people not quite reading the CNI install instructions and footgunning themselves and then getting stuck. We had clearly documented it,
Yeah.
right? But there was nothing to tell them, oops, you're doing it wrong.
Unfortunately, it mostly shows up it mostly shows up at the local tire kicking, like Kind, K3D, whatever, the local Kubernetes clusters, but we can automate that so that we can maybe intelligently pick the right thing. It's not really fair to ask people to know what CNI directory they should use. We did document it, but they shouldn't have to bother.
Yeah, Istio Cuttle should figure out all things for users that install, basically, is what we're saying.
Yeah, or even Helm, actually, probably with Helm.
Okay, yeah. Are there others? Did I miss any? Those are the ones that I saw.
There was some that was like, yeah, how do I know it's running? It's too ambient.
It's too good. Yeah, there was that one. I think the answer there was to tell them to like show connections right in ztunnel. Was that the recommendation, John?
Yeah, I think look at access logs, do the connections command, or look at metrics / Kali are all valid options. The one tricky thing with the logs is if you only have a few long-lived connections, the only log connection close. So you could be tricked, but then the connections command would be good there. I think in that case, that actually wasn't being captured. So that's why they didn't see the traffic, or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But I don't know that we have like all these troubleshooting steps or something well documented, so people may not know about these tools. And over time, more things will be documented in more places. So be a bit more obvious, hopefully.
And specifically, this was doing MTLS.
They wanted to see that it was doing MTLS, yeah. But they weren't sure if it was or was not. Or whether it was doing anything, really. The thing, also on the access logs, like the way you distinguish whether MTLS is used is whether the identities are logged. It's a little subtle. We might just want to stick a MTLS true or false, even though it's entirely redundant.
I like the Istio Cuttle suggestion, or I like answers that involve the user typing Istio Cuttle something.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking even like I don't know if people have used Hebel, they have this like monitor command. I keep thinking that we should add something like that, but then I keep thinking that it's the exact same thing as just doing kubectl logs and looking at the access logs. So I haven't convinced myself that there's value to it. But if someone has some ideas on where we could add value there, it's kind of nice. I think Linkerd is something similar too. Yeah, Linkerd tap. Like I still don't get it. Like part of me loves these commands and thinks they're awesome, but the other part of me thinks like we literally have all this info in the logs. I can't explain it. So if someone can help explain my cognitive dissonance, then maybe we can make something happen.
I think people are willing to trust a tool that tells them that Boolean verifiable assertion is true or false. Like, is traffic from X to Y encrypted or not?
Yeah, I guess that's one thing that we could add on like the tooling is it could filter the logs and say, like, I just want to see this workload or this workload to this workload or errors or whatever. Although like maybe you should be using a log aggregator to do that. But could do it ourselves too.
Okay. Probably should create a tracking issue to iterate on what an ideal UX is here. Again, we don't need to be doing cryptographic proofs. Like we're not trying to do that kind of craziness. We just need to show encryption happened for this traffic path.
Yeah, and like the way to do it now is pretty easy. Just look at the log. If it shows the identities, then it was done. We can improve that UX, but it's not hard. It's just not a trivial task.
You could do ztunnel config with istio-cuttle and look for hbone. Yeah.
That will tell you whether the intent is to send MTLS. It won't tell you whether the actual state is MTLS. Now, hopefully intent and reality are the same, of course, but I do think those are different.
Like, if you really want to know what identity was used, you can just enable proxy and set whatever label we have. I forgot so cternal send proxy to application, and application will know for sure and can programmatically verify.
I mean, I guess the other option, John, would be SSH into pod and do get peer identity for an IP address. Right, or get peer certificate, right? Like use the metadata API.
Have like an active, we never merged that, by the way, but we could. You mean like have an active connection, basically?
Yeah, just spin one up, right? Or it's like DNS lookup, right?
Yeah. Well, and you could potentially, if you have the rights to do so, have Istio do that. Say, I want to know what connections to such and such pod used MTLS, and if we had merged John's MDS work, Istio could go into that pod and check it out.
I think dumping the contract is a reasonable equivalent to that. Okay, anyway, are there any others? Any other observations from ambient usage? Alrighty. All right, we're run way over, but definitely a productive meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, good discussion.